The fluorescent airport light seared through my eyelids, and the needle at the base of my neck burned like regret. I was counted like luggage at 3:45 a.m., shoved into a van with 3 sisters and 2 parents who had rehearsed every line 1,000 times. I lay there pretending to sleep, feeling the cart wobble, counting exits and listening to them breathe, as if matching our inhales would keep us all in sync. My throat tasted like metal from the fake pills I'd spat out in the bathroom at home. I kept my eyes half closed and tried to be invisible. I wanted to move, to shout, to run, but something heavy pressed down on my ribs until my breath was small and slow. Dad lifted me onto the cart, and I felt the prick before I could pull away, quick, clinical, no hesitation. "Easy," he mouthed, like he was the one being lied to. I kept my face slack and let a single tear carve through the grime of makeup and dried dye. Someone behind me laughed, a brittle sound in the cold terminal. I heard Mom whisper, "Act like you're sleeping, quiet now," and the needle tasted like the lie itself. I thought of Maya's hands when she swallowed the pills, the folding of her fingers like she was trying to hide something inside her own palm. I wanted to tell someone the truth, but my voice was a folded paper bird, stuck inside my throat. We moved under the bright lights like we were pieces in someone else's story. I kept counting exit signs out loud in my head until my numbers blurred with the hum of fluorescent tubes. I felt another injection mark at the base of my skull, and my heart went electric. "Stay still," Dad said, but his hand shook. I wanted to tell him I wasn't afraid of pain. I was afraid of losing the small things they couldn't measure. The way I liked my cereal, the scar on my left knee from falling off a fence, the stupid songs I hummed when I walked alone. Those things were invisible to them, and I pictured packing them into a box and watching them fade. At security, a woman in a high-visibility vest glanced at us and frowned. She moved closer as the cart rolled past. My fingers tightened around the edge of the metal like I could carve my name into it. My mouth tasted of copper and fear and stubbornness. I kept my eyes nearly closed so whoever saw me would think I was just another tired kid. The woman stopped short and said, "Are they all together?" as if the question was harmless. I wanted to laugh at how obvious we looked, matching hoodies and the same stupid braid pattern. But I didn't have the breath. "You have a lane for cart?" Dad asked, voice low. He smiled like nothing was wrong. The woman looked at him twice slower than she looked at me and then touched my wrist. Her hand was a small, warm thing. "Miss, are you okay?" she asked, eyes sharp. I tried to make a sound that meant nothing, like a sleep sigh, but it came out raw. Someone else called over a radio, and a man in a badge appeared. He asked for IDs and tickets like it was a regular stop. Dad handed him envelopes with bright print and an itinerary. I watched every motion like I could memorize the pattern and find a way out later. My mother's mouth was a thin line when the badge holder frowned. "This is artist camp?" he asked, glancing from our faces to the paper. Mom's voice pitched tight. "Last minute, out of state. Quick transfer, very special program." She said it rehearsed and polite, like a script she had practiced in front of a mirror. The man looked at me longer than at my parents, and I felt my body betray me with a little gasp. It sounded like someone knew my secret name and whispered it in a crowded room. "Medic," he called quietly, and the next minutes happened so fast my head couldn't keep up. A paramedic touched the base of my neck and frowned at the redness. He checked my pulse with a practiced hand and asked, "Did someone inject you?" I almost laughed at how stupid the question sounded. Of course someone had injected me. Of course I was being taken like cargo. My dad's face turned white the way paper looks when you crumple it. My mother said, "She must have fainted," and I watched her mouth move. It was the first time I noticed how thin the skin on her hands looked, how her knuckles were always raw from gripping measurement tapes and scissors. I wanted to tell the medic everything right then, but I held it like a coin in my mouth, waiting for the right slot to drop it in. An officer called out for child services, and someone fetched a clipboard with a pen like it was a weapon. "We need to separate them for evaluation," a woman said, and I felt the cart tilt like the world was tipping under us. The thought of being pulled apart from my sisters punched the air out of me harder than the needle ever had. "Please don't," I wanted to say, but it came out as "don't," and the sound surprised me with its urgency. My mother clutched at my arm with sharp nails and said, "They can't do this, they belong with us." The officer's eyes slid past her like she didn't exist. I imagined a courtroom later with photographers and bright lights and the smell of bleach, but that future was a long road from the metal cart and the fluorescent lights. For now, the only thing I could do was keep my eyes open and watch for the next person who would notice we were not who we looked like. The cart squeaked and my breath caught with every announcement echoing overhead, and then everything slowed when the agent frowned and leaned down like she'd seen something wrong with a painting. She put her hand near my cheek without thinking, and I flinched because I didn't know if that was good or bad. She squinted at my face, then at my sisters' faces, and her eyes tracked the single tear as it rolled down my cheek. It moved like it had a map, and when she lifted my chin, the whole terminal felt louder. I watched her mouth form a question she didn't need to ask. And for the first time in a long time, the idea that someone outside our family might actually see us wasn't a private wish. It was real and hot in my chest. The agent's voice carried but kept its edge. "Ma'am, are all of them with you?" she asked my mother, and the politeness in the words didn't hide how hard she was squinting. Her supervisor came over, like a shadow slipping into a doorway, and then an officer in a navy jacket stepped forward with a badge that flashed when he moved. "Hayes," he said, introducing himself as if names could steady things. He asked quietly, "Do you have any idea what's happening here?" And my father answered with the practiced calm of someone reciting reassurance, "We're traveling for camp. Everything's fine." But Hayes looked at us in a way that read more like a question than a statement. How can a person be fine with 3 needles in their neck?
Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. All right, let's jump back into the story.
Paramedics appeared like a second wave, boots clicking on tile. One of them knelt and checked my pulse, thumbs like machine parts that had been trained to find the exact spot. He lifted the collar and his face narrowed at a tiny red pinhole at the base of my skull. He checked each sister the same way, and his expression shifted from trained neutrality to something rower, something like anger with an edge of fear. "They're all injected," he said, voice steady but tight. "Exactly the same spot." Hearing those words made the air in my lungs feel lighter, like someone had unlatched a door. I felt a rush of hope, like an elevator rising from the basement up into light, and the hope didn't quiet, it grew. I could feel it knocking in my ribs like a small animal asking to be let out. My parents moved into their lines even faster, faces smoothed over like taffy. Mom's voice went high with the practiced worry meant to sell innocence. "She always faints at airports," she said, fingers fluttering like a stagehand hiding props. "These kids are so sensitive to stress." My father gave a cleaner version of the same story, names and dates for the agent, paper tickets held out like proof. He smiled the smile they taught us whenever strangers came near, the kind that said we were organized and normal. But the paramedics had already seen enough skin to know that smile was a costume. One of them pointed to the faint circular marks and said, "We need to take them for evaluation now." And that sentence sounded to me like a verdict in a trial I hadn't known I'd been part of. Hayes's voice cut through the smooth lies like a blade. "We need a statement," he said, and the command made the terminal feel smaller. "Nobody leaves. We're putting these children on observation until we know they're safe." The word observation sounded clinical and legal and final, and it made me nearly laugh because it also sounded like protection. I wanted to tell him everything in the raw, terrible detail, the measuring tapes, the matching hair, the bindings, but the words sat like stones behind my teeth. I swallowed and let the paramedic speak for my body, while my mouth figured out how to make my truth usable, and not just noise. As they lifted us off the cart and into the paramedic's ambulance, Mom grabbed my arm in a way that tried to stop time. Her fingers dug in like a promise she wanted to keep. She mouthed, "Listen to me, you don't want this," which sounded like the same training she used on us when she told us to march in step. But Hayes's eyes were on my parents even as the medic checked our necks and made notes. He didn't look at them like a child looks at caretakers. He looked at them like someone who sees a problem that needs fixing. His gaze didn't melt under a smile. It stayed hard and patient and kind of dangerous in the exact way that cracked open the door we had been locked behind. In the ambulance, the fluorescent buzz was softer, but my heart kept the airport staccato beat. I felt my sisters around me, the steady smallness of them, and I wanted to tell them quietly, "We're getting out," but my throat was full of the taste of iodine and fear. The paramedic asked questions, not just about our health, but about names and ages and whether anyone else had been with us. I answered with the names they gave me to use, then added my own like a secret, the nicknames and the little rebellious habits. Every word I managed to say felt like a small victory, like I was grabbing back a piece of myself they had tried to fold into a pattern. The ride to the hospital felt like a narrow bridge, and as it hummed along the asphalt, the hope inside me swelled into something close to furious, like I could breathe again because someone had finally looked and refused to look away. They wheeled us into the airport clinic, and the lights were warm but felt like lamps in an interrogation room. A forensic nurse, Albina, leaned in close and started taking photos like she was catching ghosts on film. She clicked the camera at my scalp, and the screen showed raw, pale skin where dye had been rubbed until it burned. She photographed the long red lines across our ribs where the binds had left angry marks, and the little bruises on my hips and shoulders where we'd been hauled like suitcases. Albina's hands were calm and steady, and her voice was careful when she said, "I'm going to document everything. This is important." I watched the monitor and saw the proof of things I had named only to myself. A woman in a suit arrived with a badge and a quiet way of moving. Christina Owens, a social worker, sat down and introduced herself the way people do when they want to be trusted. She gave her name and asked our names too, but she didn't rush us. "You're safe now," she told us in a voice that was soft but official, like someone reading from a list that really meant it. The words hit me like cold water and then like a blanket all at once. For the first time in months, I felt the strange, electric relief of not being under someone's thumb in the same room. I wanted to cry and laugh and scream the truth into the ceiling. My parents paced in a corner with their faces put on like masks. They told the clinic staff the same story they'd told at the gate: a last-minute program, artistic opportunity, parental oversight. My mother kept her hands busy, smoothing the same invisible crease in her skirt, and my father handed over paperwork like evidence of good intent. "We only wanted them to have options," Mom said, eyes bright with rehearsed fervor. "We did everything for their future," Dad added, voice low. They looked like two actors who had memorized lines they believed, or maybe wanted to believe, and they kept trying to make us props in their story. Albina clicked her camera again and turned the screen so a nurse could see the images. She said, "This pattern of scarring is consistent with repeated chemical exposure and prolonged binding." The medical words landed heavy and sharp in the room, and I felt them cut through the neat explanations my parents kept offering. The nurse noted that the injection sites were fresh and the exact same spot on each of our necks, a detail that made the whole thing look less like a one-off and more like a plan. The documentation was clinical and clean, but what it showed wasn't tidy or reasonable. It looked like deliberate harm. Christina asked simple questions in the kind of voice that expected small answers. "How old are you? Do you have anyone else we should call? Where did your parents say they were taking you?" I answered, and with each sentence I felt myself laying out pieces of a life the way you might set stones to make a path across a river. It was terrifying and steadying. I told her about the morning pills, about the van, and about how we'd been measured every day. I told her about the one time I tried to get on a bus when I was 15, and the locks that were installed afterward. Saying these things out loud made them real in a way that made me both lighter and heavier at the same time. A doctor came in and ran quick checks: heart rate, reflexes, the way I breathed. He asked about pain and sleep, and whether we'd been forced into any medical procedures at home. I heard my sister's answers next to mine, and we fit together like a jigsaw that didn't want to show the picture the adults expected to see. Hazel answered slower, like someone walking across ice. Ruby's voice thinned with anger when she said she'd been forced to keep her voice down until it nearly disappeared. Maya stayed quiet and looked like she was folding inward. the way someone does when they're holding on to a memory like a secret talisman. Later, when the officer left to make calls, my mother stood too close and said, "We only wanted them to be special." Her whisper came out like the last piece of a failed script. I looked at her, and it felt like looking through glass at a reflection that was almost mine but wrong at the edges. The photographs on the camera's screen contradicted her words. They showed clear evidence of injury and coercion, and that made me feel vindicated and ashamed at the same time. The shame was sharp because we had been trained to believe we were being improved, and the truth made me angry that I had been taught to accept pain as proof of love. Christina told us they'd place us into protective custody and that we'd stay apart from our parents until an investigation could be done. She explained it slowly so it would sink in: evaluations, a court hearing, temporary guardianship. The plan sounded like a long rope thrown across a river, and I wanted to grab it and pull all of us across. Relief washed over me in ugly, powerful waves, but it came flanked by guilt for leaving my parents, for wanting out, for the strange relief of safety that felt like betrayal. My sisters and I clung to each other in a way that wasn't about matching, but about remembering we were still ourselves beneath all the measures and the matching cotton. The clinic lights buzzed, and the camera stayed warm in Albina's hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like there might be time to choose who I wanted to be. They moved through the house like it was a crime scene because it was, and the sound of the warrants being read felt like a verdict in our empty rooms. Hayes led the team, and their faces were professional and steady, which made the whole thing feel real in a way I couldn't fake. I watched as they unlocked the bedroom doors that had only ever opened outwards, the hinges whining like a long-held secret finally being let go. The room smelled like shampoo and old paint, and the relief that rushed through me at the sight of the open doors surprised me with how fierce it was. They pulled cameras out from places I didn't know people could put cameras: stove vents, a teddy bear, the base of a lamp that had always been too heavy. Every lens had been pointed at us for years. One of the techs held up a tiny lens the size of a fingernail and said, "This is pretty sophisticated." I felt a new kind of burned shame, the sort that comes when someone finds your hidden diary. But beneath that shame was a cold, steady satisfaction, proof that what we'd called normal wasn't normal at all. The house had been wired to monitor our every move, and now it was a house full of receipts for the things my voice had been trying to name for years. They laid out stacks of measurement logs on the kitchen table like a map. Daily hair length notes, inches down to the millimeter, cut with a ruler trim records, notes about bra cup padding, even a spreadsheet of matching parameters with boxes ticked off. I almost laughed at how thorough it was: cruel, obsessive detail that read like homework for a project called The Perfect Sisters. My father's handwriting looped through the pages with dates and times, and my mother's neat columns listed dye schedules and which shade had been used that week. Seeing it all on paper made the control feel less like an abstract weight and more like a machine someone had built to grind us smooth. They opened boxes with padded bras and ace bandages stacked like military supplies. One box had receipts for a foreign clinic and printed emails with annotated photos showing lines on our faces and little surgical markers. The email subject lines were clinical and calm: appointment confirmation, pre-op instructions, and an attached wire transfer confirmation for the deposit. Seeing the deposit confirmation made my stomach drop like a stone: $28,000 on a tab that had our names and dates circled. That number felt like proof someone had planned to alter our bodies without our say. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed like an old book. Hayes stood back and watched us with an expression that didn't pity but understood. "We need to catalog everything," he told the team, and someone read us our rights again like a slow drumbeat. They photographed the long red abrasions across the ribs where bindings had left scars, the chemical burns on our scalps where dye had been forced until the skin peeled, and bruises in places that matched the story of being manhandled. Each photo made the past feel both smaller and larger. Smaller because the chaos had a shape, larger because the shape was ugly and hard to come to terms with. They found a binder labeled Family Image with pages of rules about posture, voice pitch, and synchronized movement. I flipped through it without touching, like I could look and not own it. There were charts with practice times and penalties listed for breaking the rules. One page had a list titled Unacceptable Variations, and the handwriting circled Solo Activities and Independence. Reading those words made the air in my chest tight. They had written the rules of our erasure and kept them in a neat binder like instructions for a play we were forced to perform. The investigators pulled up a work computer and traced emails and messages. They found payment records and a trail of conversations with the clinic's admin. Someone printed a log that showed my father's work computer had accessed accounts late at night. It was like watching the evidence point a finger. I felt oddly vindicated, the way a wound feels better when someone names it. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of officers and the camera clicks, and I sat on the couch with a blanket over my knees and let the noise happen around me like rain I couldn't stop. My parents argued in low voices at the kitchen island while Hayes wrote notes. Their words were the same rehearsed defense I'd heard 1,000 times. We wanted the best. It was for their future. We were protecting family values. But now their script didn't land. Albina's photos and the documented injections had already said otherwise. I watched Mom cover her face with her hands and Dad stare at the floor. And for the first time, I saw them not as infallible adults, but as people who'd built a wall and then used us as the mortar. When the team boxed up evidence, they asked us a few questions about things we had forgotten to tell earlier. The simple questions, where they'd kept the measuring tape, who bought the padding, when the surgeries had been scheduled, came out like stones into a bag that law would carry. Christina Owens called to coordinate next steps, her voice calm and steady like a bridge between the chaos and the outside world. Standing there, surrounded by the boxed pieces of our old life, I felt exposed and tender and strange in the same moment. Finally, the system could see the pattern. Finally, the story we'd lived in silence had lines someone else could trace. That reality brought a sharp relief, but it also left an ache where my whole childhood had been taken and cataloged by people who looked at bills and photos and called it evidence. The hearing room smelled like coffee and paperwork, and something meant to be official. I sat on hard chairs with my sisters in a line like we were waiting for someone to call us up, and the weight of the room felt like a blanket you couldn't throw off. A judge with a tired voice presided and called everyone forward. Albina stood and explained the medical risks in clear, clinical phrases: facial bone changes, rib resections, vocal cord surgery, and she showed the photos that made those words into facts. When she spoke, the room listened like it was holding its breath. Hayes described the timeline from the airport to the house search like he was telling a story to a kid, but the story had brutal details. He spoke about the injections, the camera placement, the measurement logs, and the refunded wire transfer that never should have happened. These were coordinated actions, he said plainly, and the words landed like stones on the judge's desk. I watched my parents from across the room, sitting close together like a small island trying to stay afloat. Their lawyer stood when it was their turn and argued in a steady voice about parental rights and religious freedom, phrases that sounded like shields. My mother spoke finally, voice thin and high. "We only wanted them to have every advantage," she said, and it sounded rehearsed and hollow in the room. My father added, "We were preparing them for a very particular life," as if that made sense to anyone else. The judge looked through them slowly and then toward the photos Albina had submitted. He didn't seem moved by their words. He was moved by what he could see and what he could read in paper and pixels. The judge asked a few direct questions about the injections and the communication with the foreign clinic. My throat tightened at every mention of the clinic's name because that was the part that had scared me most. When the judge finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision. "Given the medical documentation and the evidence presented, I must order temporary removal from parental custody," he said, and the phrase landed like a bell. He set conditions: supervised visits only, no unauthorized medical decisions by the parents, and a full hearing in a few weeks to determine long-term arrangements. He assigned child services as temporary guardians and ordered psychological evaluations for our parents. The room hummed with the low sound of papers being shuffled and people exhaling. The order felt both final and like a start. Someone else had to hold the pieces for a while. Walking out of the courthouse felt like walking out of a fog. My sisters and I were led to a small room with chairs and a vending machine, and a social worker explained what would happen next. Christina Owens, who had been with us since the clinic, told us gently that we'd be placed into temporary care and that investigators would keep gathering evidence. She asked if we wanted anything called for us, like friends or a favorite blanket, and the question felt small and huge at the same time. I told her I wanted paper and a pen because I needed to make a record that was mine, not the measured notes that had been kept for us. That evening, I lay in a hospital bed under a thin blanket, and the fluorescent lights hummed like the airport's, familiar and harsh. My sisters were nearby, each in their own cot, and the room smelled like antiseptic and tired hope. I reached for a pen and began to write everything down: the van, the injections, the measurement sheets, Maya's pills, because I wanted a version of the story that came from my mouth and my memory, not from the voices that had been imposed on us. Writing felt like pulling teeth and like opening a door at the same time. The words came in fits. Some lines were raw and jagged, others careful and precise. I wrote about the little things that mattered: the crown of my head where the dye had burned, the way we used to argue about who got the top bunk, the sound of our mother's scissors on a Sunday morning. I wrote about the way my sisters mirrored me without meaning to, the small rituals that had kept us sane, and the private jokes that no one had timed or logged. Each sentence felt like a small act of rescue, a piece of myself I could hide in a drawer and take out later when the world got loud. When I finished for the night, I folded the paper and slid it into my jacket like it was a talisman. Relief and guilt tangled up in my chest: relief because we were out and someone had believed us, guilt because the legal process would split us up sometimes, and because I knew our parents still loved something, even if that something had hurt us. I drifted in and out of sleep with the paper under my fingers, thinking that if the judge had ordered protection, it had also ordered a chance. That small chance was all I had for now, so I held on to it the way you hold the edge of a cliff when you hope someone will throw you a rope. Foster placement was messy and noisy, like a room trying to decide on a temperature, and the first thing they told us was the worst: they might split us up. Most homes didn't have room for 4 teenagers, and the social worker's face showed how much paperwork could hurt when it involved people. I remember Christina saying, "We'll try to keep you together," like she was promising something heavy, and my chest tightened because promises had been broken before. My instinct kicked in without thinking. I offered to go alone so my sisters could stay together, and the act felt both noble and selfish at the same time. "I'll go," I told Christina, and it came out steady, like I had practiced it 100 times though I hadn't. My sisters looked at me with raw, honest gratitude and a little fear. Hazel grabbed my hand, small and quick, and said, "Don't go too far, okay?" As if distance could be measured in footsteps. Ruby tried to joke and fluffed her shoulders like she was fine, but the eyes told a different story. Maya just nodded and kept her face turned down, holding something inside that hadn't yet found words. I left the house wondering whether leaving was a betrayal or a rescue, and that question followed me like a shadow. My new room had a lock that worked from the inside and a window that looked out at a small yard. For the first time in years, a key actually fit the door the way it should, and I clicked it closed like setting a seal. The foster mother, a steady woman named Rosa, showed me 3 sets of pajamas laid out on the bed as if choosing clothes could be a ceremony. "What do you like?" she asked, hands warm and plain. I picked the floral set without thinking too hard, and the choice felt foreign and kind and a little dangerous. The floral pajamas were ridiculous and soft, and I laughed, surprised at how much pleasure a tiny rebellion could bring. The house had rules but also small freedoms. A kitchen drawer I could call my own, a second-hand bike in the shed, TV shows that didn't require matching. At dinner, Rosa asked small questions about school and friends, and then listened like it was the important part. My sisters were together in another home down the street, and they sent texts and short, ridiculous selfies that made me both laugh and ache. We promised a daily check-in time and used it like a lifeline. The arrangement was messy, imperfect, and human, and for the first time in a long while, I could feel my edges loosening. Therapy began with a man named Ephraim, a counselor who had a way of making small things into tools. "I'm Ephraim," he said the first day, holding up his hands like a slow gesture. "We'll start with tiny goals." He explained breathing exercises and asked me to name feelings like they were objects I could hold. At first, it felt like a game for toddlers, and I resisted, but the breathing did something to the tightness in my chest. We practiced saying, "I feel scared," out loud until the words stopped sounding like accusations and started to sound like data. Ephraim gave us homework that was almost laughably simple. Notice 3 things you liked today. Pick a snack you really wanted. Choosing mismatched snacks at group sessions became a ritual. The first time I picked chips with chocolate, my hands shook like a criminal stealing something minor. A woman in the group laughed and said, "Bold choice," and the small praise hit me like sunshine. These tiny acts of self-decided taste were quiet rebellions. Each mismatched snack, each wrong color sock, felt like reclaiming the right to make tiny, messy choices. Sometimes the choices hurt because they showed how long we'd been living without them, but they also built something slowly and stubbornly. At first, nights were hard. Dreams picked from a scissor box, the echo of measuring tape. I would wake and listen for cameras that weren't there anymore and count breaths until dawn. But the lock on my door felt real, and it kept me from imagining hands opening it again. I wrote in the notebook I'd kept since the hospital, and the pages filled with small lists. Songs I liked, things I missed, things I wanted to learn. I started a list called My Choices and added simple things like pick different shoes and learn to ride the bike without falling. Each line felt like a stitch. Visits with my sisters were arranged and watched, but they were gentle in their own blunt ways. We ate pizza and tried new toppings, and Maya smiled at the weird ones, a small thing that felt enormous. Ruby practiced violin in bursts, and Scarlett, no, Hazel, joined a physical therapy group and sent goofy videos. We were all learning to be separate people who still loved each other. The legal stuff trundled along like a slow machine. Hearings and evaluations and more questions, but the daily acts of living felt like the real work. One night, I called my mother to ask a question about something small and ordinary, and she cried on the phone in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with loss. I told her I was okay, and then hung up because I needed to be my sister's protector and my own person. Somewhere between the floral pajamas and the mismatched snacks, I began to feel like more than a set of measurements. It was slow and clumsy, but it felt like living. I held onto the small decisions and the tiny freedoms like rope, and I walked forward one deliberate step at a time. The courtroom smelled like paper and coffee and the kind of quiet that makes you speak louder than you mean to. I sat with Bridget Ainsworth, my guardian ad litem, and she leaned over and said, "We're going to practice your answers. Keep them short and clear. Don't let them lead you." Her voice was calm and firm, like a map for a place I didn't want to get lost. I nodded because practicing felt like armor, even if my hands were still shaking. When they called my name, I walked to the stand and felt the floor under my feet like it was one of the few honest things in the room. Bridget whispered reminders in my ear about staying steady and speaking true. "They'll push," she warned, "but you have the facts." I took a breath and told the court the clinic's name out loud. Clinica Estrella, the one across the border. Saying it felt like dropping a stone into a clear pool. The ripples had a way of reaching people. I told them about the wire transfer. $28,000 sent weeks before the date stamped on the confirmation. I described the emails with the annotated photos, the deposit confirmation printed out on the kitchen table in our house. I said, "They plan to shave our cheekbones, remove ribs, and modify our vocal cords." The words came out flat because saying them like that stopped them from folding into a fantasy. It made them legal and real. Bridget had taught me to speak plainly so the judge, and the lawyers couldn't turn my sentence into something else. Albina stood and explained the medical injuries with an even voice that made the words land harder. She showed pictures of chemical burns on our scalps, long abrasions across our ribs from binding, and the tiny, fresh injection marks at the nape of our necks. These are consistent with deliberate practices meant to alter and suppress, she said. Seeing the photos again in the courtroom was like watching a looped film of the worst parts of our lives. The images had teeth. They bit into the official record. Hayes laid out the chain from the airport intervention to the search warrant at our house. He described the cart at 3:45 a.m., the agent who noticed the tear on my cheek, the paramedic who found the injection sites, and the warrant that opened our rooms. He read off the items they seized: cameras hidden in vents, measurement logbooks, ace bandages, padded bras, and the clinic correspondence. Hearing it all listed like inventory made the plan feel less abstract and more like a construction that someone had built and funded. My parents' lawyer tried the usual lines about parental rights and religious freedom. He asked questions meant to frame the control as care and the rules as guidance. He asked if any of us consented to the changes. I answered no. He pushed harder, but Bridget coached me through each corner so they couldn't snag my words and twist them. I kept my sentences short and to the point. Saying no again and again felt like throwing light into dark places. The judge listened to every witness and looked at the photos and documents with a steady gaze. When he spoke, his words were legal and simple. He extended the state's removal of custody and ordered that any contact be supervised. He required psychological evaluations for both parents and put a hold on any medical decisions they could make for us. The ruling didn't fix the damage, but it put guardrails around what could happen next. It felt like a fence that might keep the worst of it from happening again. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt tired and oddly relieved. Legal protections were not the same as healing, and I knew that in my bones. But protections mattered because they bought time and space for therapy, for separate identities, for the slow undoing of patterns. Bridget squeezed my hand and said, "You did well. You told the truth." Her words landed like a small anchor. I clutched the papers I had written in the hospital and the notebook on my lap and thought about my sisters. The ruling was not perfect closure. It was a kind of beginning that had teeth and rules and a chance to keep us safe long enough to try to become ourselves again. Months after the courtroom, healing came in slow, messy waves that knocked the wind out of us and then left us standing again, wobbling but upright. I met with Ephraim, my counselor, in a bright room with chairs like islands. "Tiny steps," he told me on the first day, and we practiced saying no and setting boundaries like they were new muscles. Group sessions felt awkward at first, sharing snacks and feelings with strangers, but each small boundary I practiced made the edges of me sharper and easier to hold. Hazel, my sister, had scans that confirmed spinal damage from years of forced slouching and posture drills. The orthopedic doctor explained it in plain language. This is wear and stress. It needs therapy and time. I watched Hazel learn to stand without the invisible rule they had drilled into us. She went to physical therapy and learned how to stretch the parts of her body that had been trained to fold. She complained, she pushed back, she laughed at small gains. Watching her relearn how to move felt like watching someone unlearn a lie. Ruby went to an ENT and the doctor found vocal nodules from weeks of forced low singing and voice training. He told her, "You can heal, but you must use your voice without strain." Ruby practiced speaking and singing again with careful exercises. The first time she played the violin after the diagnosis, her bow arm shook and her sound was raw. She kept playing anyway, and the noise made rooms feel honest. I remember her saying, "It sounds like me, even if it's cracked," and I thought that cracked things sometimes let light in. Maya had a difficult stretch where she needed inpatient psychiatric care after her suicide attempt the week before the scheduled surgeries. The hospital helped stabilize her and gave her tools to handle panic and despair. I visited and held her hand through glass and talked about small things like which TV shows were trash and which cookies were worth stealing from the vending machine. She told me about being tired in a way that was different than sleep, and I learned how to listen without trying to fix everything. Her recovery wasn't neat, but she came back to us with quieter storms and a carved-out space for herself. We learned small rituals to mark our separateness, different haircuts that didn't match, different drinks at dinner, and a rule that we could not mirror each other on purpose. "You don't have to be my twin anymore," I told Hazel one night, and she smiled like the words had just been invented. I tried soccer in cleats that were mine, not ordered for an image. The first practice, I ran hard and fell on the grass, and the pain was honest and mine. The coach yelled, "Get up." And I did, not because we were supposed to, but because I wanted to. The foreign clinic was investigated and flagged in databases, but the lead surgeon's trail grew cold in places where money can disappear and people can slip away. Investigators shut down locations, issued warnings, and shared evidence with foreign authorities, but some doors stayed closed. I felt a strange, empty triumph. A clinic got flagged, but the person who had planned the alterations was still a shadow. It made me angrier and more determined at the same time. We kept reporting emails and messages, and turned over every scrap of proof we had. My parents violated the no-contact orders and tried to reach us with anonymous messages. They'd send coded things that felt like vultures testing a fence. Investigators traced one message back to my father's work computer and filed contempt motions. The lawyer said, "This will matter in court," and I felt less alone as legal threads pulled tighter around their behavior. Still, reading an email from a hidden account that said, "We only did this for love," heated a rage in me that started as hot and then turned cold and steady. I kept my replies short and let the lawyers do the rest. Slowly, in fits and starts, with holes of relapse and moments of real clarity, we began to choose our faces, our voices, and our lives. I stopped answering in the same pitch as the others on purpose. I learned to order my own coffee and pick a jacket that had no match. We made mistakes. We hurt each other sometimes when old habits snapped back like rubber bands. But we also learned funny private jokes that weren't rehearsed and rituals that belonged only to each of us. 4 sisters, once shaped to look like one, started to be distinct people who still loved each other in complicated ways. We were messy and brave and stubborn, and that was enough for now.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.